You know what? That race wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. In fact, it was quite good in my view. I was one of those that was of the view that the French Grand Prix would be a bog-standard one-stop race, with it being nigh on impossible to overtake on track, or in other words, a snooze fest. But I was wrong. It was a tactical battle, and the tyre wear was significantly greater than the teams expected, which resulted in split strategies and overtakes all over the place. Not the greatest race of the year by any means, but there were some talking points to discuss, so here are my 5 things we learned from the French Grand Prix. Let's have a look. My name's Andy, and this is Behind the Drive. Mercedes' tactical blunder. Even I could work out that before the leaders came into the pits, the undercut was unbelievably strong. You could see that based on the fact that Daniel Ricciardo had just got himself past Gasly and Sainz, and Leclerc had got back past Ricciardo, as well as getting past the AlphaTauri driver and Leclerc's teammate. But the Mercedes team pitted Bottas first, and left it 2 laps before bringing Hamilton in the pits, and it was a silly and unforced error from the team which cost them the lead of the Grand Prix. To add insult to injury, Red Bull then used Mercedes' own tactic against them as they went for the second stop towards the end with Verstappen, which cost them the win, just as Mercedes did to Red Bull in Spain this year. So it needs to be a red box for Mercedes and their tactical mistakes at the French Grand Prix. There were so many mistakes from Mercedes this afternoon, and they even said on the radio that it was on them this weekend, as they let their drivers down by getting caught out tactically. It seems like both Bottas and Hamilton said at various times that the tyres wouldn't make it to the end at a decent race pace, and that the optimum strategy would be a 2-stopper, so it's a shame that they didn't realise this earlier. I also find it so confusing that they didn't even split the strategies between their drivers in response to Verstappen's second stop. On the undercut, I can't understand why the team didn't identify the fact that the undercut was so strong. There was so much evidence that the undercut was there, as I've already mentioned, and gaining 3 seconds was not out of the realms of possibility. But they didn't seem to realise as Bono told Hamilton that he'd be 1.5 seconds ahead of Verstappen as he ran down towards the pit lane exit, and then ended up behind the Red Bull as the driver got back up to racing speed. And then the third significant tactical blunder that the Mercedes team made was failing to bring Valtteri Bottas into the pits after he'd been overtaken by Sergio Perez towards the end of the Grand Prix. Max Verstappen was the driver to take the fastest lap on this occasion, and it's given him and Red Bull another point, which is costing both Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes overall. At one stage it looked like they might make that decision to do so, as they brought some tyres out into the pit lane to make sure that they got that fastest lap point. But they didn't, and I'm confused that they made this decision this weekend, having gone for that extra point at nearly every other race so far when they had the opportunity. It was poor from Mercedes this afternoon once again, and I think this is the 3rd time in a row that I've given them a red box. And whilst their car looks slightly better than it's been over the last few weeks, really they've underperformed at a track that we would have been expecting the Silver Arrows to be the best car on the grid. It shows that Red Bull have taken a step forward once again, particularly with their Honda power unit, but their tactical blunder is what really cost them this afternoon, and that's something that's very much within their control. I expect it will be back to the drawing board for Mercedes as they fell further behind in the championship. Perez continues to show his worth at Red Bull. Perez has once again proved his worth for Red Bull this weekend in my opinion, as he went long on the first stint on his used medium tyres. The extra long stint was made possible by the fact that Perez could manage the tyres well, and this gave him the relatively fresher tyres when compared to Valtteri Bottas at the end of the Grand Prix, and it got him the podium finish at a race that by the looks of the early stages looked like he would be in a distant 4th. It's a great asset for the team as it gives them the tactical advantage in the championship when compared to the likes of Mercedes. So it's a green box for Perez and the way that he's handling himself in that seat. It all worked out very well, and yes, Perez didn't get himself ahead of Hamilton in the end, but he did well enough to make sure he got ahead of Bottas. When you think about the Constructors' Championship, they extended their lead once again to a whopping 37 points, and they had 2 drivers on the podium. Perez has also got himself into a position where he can score podiums on a regular basis, and on occasions, race wins. I'm so glad that he's finally got the car that he deserves, and I'm sure he's absolutely loving it this year when compared to his last few years in the sport. Even though he's just offering backup for Verstappen and is occasionally needing to let him through as he did this afternoon, he's achieving some of the best results of his career, and clearly gets what his job is at Red Bull. McLaren's risky strategy pays off for Norris. After we saw how strong the undercut was, I thought that McLaren and Lando Norris had shot themselves in the foot during the race as they went along on their first stint, just as Perez did. But after coming out of the pits behind all of the cars that he was ahead of before the stops, Norris carved his way back through the order, ending up getting himself to 5th position by the end of the race. So it's a green box for McLaren and Lando Norris for me. It was a different and potentially risky strategy, given how difficult it's been to overtake around here historically, but they made it work as they became the 3rd strongest constructor this weekend, despite not having the best form in qualifying. It's also worth mentioning how well Daniel Ricciardo has done this weekend. It felt like the last of the late breakers version of Ricciardo had returned, and we saw that from the opening laps as he made some great moves on his McLaren teammate and also Fernando Alonso. He also did a stellar job to work with aging tyres and was the lead car out of that group that dived into the pits following Leclerc. It allowed him to take 6th position in the end and was a contributing factor to a huge haul of points for McLaren, particularly when compared to Ferrari. Ferrari's dropping like a stone. And building on that previous point, after a couple of relatively good weekends for Ferrari in Monaco and Azerbaijan, it was looking like they could do it again, after qualifying on Saturday with Sainz taking 5th and Leclerc taking 7th. But both drivers struggled on Sunday as they dropped through the order like a stone. So it's a red box for Ferrari this weekend, as they lost out in the battle for 3rd in the championship with McLaren and are now 16 points behind the Papaya team. It was tricky for Ferrari as it looked like the undercut had worked like a dream for Charles Leclerc as he got past his teammate and Pierre Gasly, but his early stop also meant that he was one of the first to learn that the hard tyres wouldn't last as long as the team had expected. It meant that he dropped through the order and was forced to pit again, which put him a lap down and running in 16th come the end of the Grand Prix. As for Sainz, well, he had a great qualifying, and he ended up 2 places ahead of his teammate in the best of the rest spot. But he finished outside of the points in 11th, meaning the team took home 0 points between their drivers. It was always to be expected that the Ferrari car wouldn't be as good around Paul Ricard, but I certainly didn't think that they'd fall back that far after back-to-back pole positions for Charles Leclerc and a strong showing in qualifying. It looks like it could be a tough next couple of races once again for the team in Austria, as it's a much higher speed circuit once again. Track limits strike again. Track limits was, once again, a theme of the weekend, and this debate continues to rage on in Formula 1. It feels like over the last couple of years it's become a debate at almost every race, unless there are gravel traps preventing the drivers from pushing the boundaries. 7 of the 15 corners at Paul Ricard were being monitored for track limits this weekend, and again this changed between sessions when looking at the exit of turn 6. And for me, it needs to be a red box for track limits this weekend. I think this is one of many issues with the Paul Ricard circuit, as it's purely asphalt runoff. It means the drivers push the limits, and right now the FIA are simply not doing enough to stop them before the start of the weekend. But it adds difficulty when the drivers extend the track. Max Verstappen was one of the many drivers that did this throughout qualifying, and even on his pole lap he track extended at turn 2, and he subsequently put in the fastest sector 1. It was noted by the FIA, but at turn 2 it wasn't the exit of the corner that was being monitored. It begs the question as to why they can't use sensors, as they did at Imola and as MotoGP do. Other drivers also had times deleted in qualifying, mostly for the exit of turn 6, and it actually cost Lance Stroll in particular as he failed to progress through from Q1 as a result of not delivering a valid lap time on his first couple of runs and then getting caught out by Schumacher's incident at the end of Q1. Not only this, but the other reason it gets a red box from me are because of the complaints that the teams made early on in the weekend. The yellow sausage curbs at turn 2 are quite simply car breakers, as they run perpendicular to the direction of travel of the cars. On Friday, Valtteri Bottas damaged his wing after going a few feet off the circuit. The Mercedes team then complained to Michael Masi and the FIA to say that they'd suffered potentially £100,000 worth of damage. Masi had very little sympathy, citing that the curbs were there when Formula 1 visited the track in 2018 and 2019. But with the budget cap that's in place for this season, the amount of car damage is going to be potentially significant for the teams as they attempt to balance spending on this year's car and next year's regulations within the cost cap. For me, this whole situation is completely unnecessary, and could be avoided by both the FIA, by forcing the circuits to make these curbs run in the direction of the cars, which would then make the cars less likely to end up damaged, or by removing the sausage curbs from the circuit altogether. But also the teams. If they tell the drivers to avoid the curbs, they should be doing so, particularly when they run the risk of spending more and more money on repairs throughout the season. So it's a red box, as I've well and truly had enough of talking track limits this season, especially when installing sensors could solve the issue. Honourable mentions. On to honourable mentions now, and I think it's got to be the Aston Martin cars first, and particularly Lance Stroll. Last time out in Azerbaijan, he was having a great race until the high-speed tyre failure cost him a great drive up the order. And once again, this afternoon he drove a great race from 19th on the grid to 10th at the end, with a great stint on the hard tyres. Then also, I want to call out George Russell for finishing 12th in his Williams, his best finish yet of this season, and moving up the order overall from his starting spot. So what did you learn from the French Grand Prix? Were you surprised as I was? Let me know what you learned in the comments, and if you enjoyed the video and watched this far, then hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this one throughout the 2021 season.